Let's dive straight in.
Tenerife Airport Disaster. It was 12:30 p.m., March 27, 1977, at Los Rodeos Airport on the island of Tenerife, part of Spain's Canary Islands. Normally, this airport was pretty quiet, but that day it was packed. A terrorist bomb had gone off earlier at a bigger airport nearby, forcing a ton of planes to land here instead. Among them were two giants, a KLM 747 from the Netherlands and a Pan Am 747 from the United States. Both were full of passengers, families, and vacationers just trying to get to their destinations. By 2 p.m., the airport was chaos. Planes were lined up on the taxiways, and the small air traffic control tower was overwhelmed. Thick fog started rolling in, making it harder and harder to see even a few hundred feet ahead. The Pan Am crew joked over the radio about how crowded it was, but underneath, everyone knew the situation was tense. At 4:30 p.m., things started moving again. The KLM 747 was cleared onto the only runway to get in position for takeoff. The Pan Am 747 was told to taxi down the same runway but exit at the third turnoff, letting them get out of the way. Because of the fog, neither plane could see the other clearly. They were basically on a collision course without realizing it. By 4:56 p.m., radio chatter became confusing. The KLM captain, a highly respected pilot, thought he had clearance to take off. But in reality, he was only cleared to line up and wait. Miscommunication, static, and language barriers played a huge role here. As the KLM pushed its engines to full power and began racing down the runway, the Pan Am was still taxiing straight toward them, trying to find the exit. At 4:58 p.m., the Pan Am crew suddenly spotted the KLM's massive lights through the fog. "There he is," one of the pilots shouted. They slammed the throttles and tried to turn off the runway, but it was too late. The KLM 747 barreled toward them at takeoff speed. The captain pulled the nose up, trying to jump over the Pan Am, but the bottom of his plane ripped across the top of the American jet. In a split second, both planes erupted in fire. The KLM exploded instantly, killing everyone on board, more than 240 people. The Pan Am was torn apart, flames sweeping through the cabin. Some passengers managed to escape by jumping out of holes in the fuselage, but most didn't make it. In total, 583 people lost their lives, making it the deadliest aviation accident in history. By 5:15 p.m., the runway was a nightmare scene: burning metal, screaming survivors, and rescue crews struggling in the fog. It was later found that if the Pan Am had turned off at the earlier exit, or if the KLM captain had waited just seconds longer, the disaster could have been avoided. The Tenerife tragedy forced huge changes in aviation. Afterward, English radio communication rules were standardized worldwide, and pilots were trained to always confirm clearances clearly. But for the families on board, those changes came too late. Japan Airlines Flight 123. It was 6 p.m., August 12, 1985, at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747, was getting ready for a routine domestic flight to Osaka. On board were 524 people, families heading home, business travelers, and crew members finishing a long day. The flight was supposed to last less than an hour. Nobody could have imagined it would turn into the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. By 6:12 p.m., the plane took off smoothly. Everything seemed normal. But within 12 minutes, at about 6:24 p.m., a loud bang shook the aircraft. Passengers felt the plane jolt, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. In the cockpit, the pilots realized something catastrophic had happened. The rear pressure bulkhead, a huge panel that keeps the cabin pressurized, had burst. The explosion ripped off part of the tail and destroyed all 4 hydraulic systems. In simple terms, the crew had almost no control over the plane. By 6:30 p.m., the aircraft was struggling to stay in the air. Without hydraulics, the plane's controls were useless. The pilots tried to maneuver by adjusting the engines, but it was like trying to steer a car by only pumping the gas pedal. Passengers in the back could see the tail was gone. People were screaming, praying, writing notes to loved ones on scraps of paper. At 6:40 p.m., the plane was supposed to be nearing Osaka, but instead it was wildly circling the mountains northwest of Tokyo. Air traffic controllers begged the pilots to head back toward Haneda, but the crew could barely keep the plane level. Fighter jets were scrambled to try to follow the struggling 747, but by the time they got close, it was already in deep trouble. By 6:50 p.m., After more than 25 minutes of fighting the impossible, the crew knew they couldn't keep the aircraft in the air much longer. The plane was dropping altitude fast, and passengers braced for impact. Some wrote goodbye notes to their families, which were later found in the wreckage. At 6:56 p.m., Flight 123 slammed into a ridge of Mount Takamagara, about 70 miles from Tokyo. The impact was devastating. The plane broke apart and caught fire. Out of 524 people on board, 520 were killed instantly. Amazingly, for survived, all women, including a 12-year-old girl. They were found hours later, clinging to life in the wreckage. By the next morning, August 13th, rescue crews and reporters reached the crash site. What they saw was heartbreaking. Twisted metal scattered across the mountainside, burned belongings, and handwritten notes that never reached their families. One note from a father read, "Mama, please take care of the children." The investigation revealed that the disaster traced back to a repair made 7 years earlier. A Boeing team had incorrectly fixed the rear bulkhead after a tail strike incident. Over time, cracks spread until it finally gave way mid-flight. Japan Airlines Flight 123 changed aviation safety forever, but it's still remembered most for the sheer scale of loss, and for the brave pilots who kept the plane flying nearly 30 minutes after losing all control. Charkhi Dadri collision. It was 6:10 p.m., November 12, 1996, at Indira Gandhi International Airport in New Delhi, India. The evening was clear, skies wide open, and flights were moving in and out without much delay. Two very different planes were heading toward the city at the same time. Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a big Boeing 747 carrying 312 people, and Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, a smaller aviation IL-76 with 37 people on board. Neither crew knew that within minutes, their paths would tragically cross. By 6:30 p.m., the Saudi plane had just taken off, climbing steadily and heading west. At the same time, the Kazakhstan jet was approaching from the opposite direction, descending into Delhi. Air traffic control was keeping both flights on separate altitude levels. At least, that's how it was supposed to work. The Saudi jet was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet, while the Kazakhstan jet was supposed to level off at 15,000 feet. At 6:35 p.m., miscommunication started to creep in. The Kazakhstan crew, who spoke limited English, struggled to understand the controller's instructions. Instead of holding at 15,000 feet, they began descending lower. The Saudi plane, climbing right in front of them, had no idea that the other aircraft was dropping into their lane. By 6:38 p.m., the two massive planes were unknowingly barreling toward each other at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. In the Saudi cockpit, everything looked routine. They were still climbing. In the Kazakhstan cockpit, the pilots thought they were on the right path. Air traffic control, working with outdated radar, only realized too late that both flights were now on a collision course. At 6:40 p.m., just outside the village of Charkhi Dadri, disaster struck. The nose and wing of the Saudi 747 sliced straight into the descending Kazakh plane. In an instant, both aircraft were torn apart midair. Fireballs lit up the night sky, and pieces of wreckage rained down on farmland below. Villagers looked up in horror as burning debris and bodies fell across their fields. By 6:50 p.m., rescue teams were rushing toward the crash sites. But the devastation was total. The Saudi jet had disintegrated in the air, and the Kazakhstan plane had broken apart completely. There were no survivors. All 349 people on both planes lost their lives, making it the world's deadliest mid-air collision. The next morning, November 13th, investigators walked across scorched fields littered with wreckage and belongings. It was clear almost immediately what had happened. The Kazakhstan crew had descended below their assigned altitude, most likely because of language barriers and poor communication with air traffic control. The tragedy pushed global aviation to act. India installed modern radar systems, and international aviation authorities strengthened English language requirements for pilots and controllers. But for the families of the 349 victims, those lessons came at a devastating cost. Turkish Airlines Flight 981. It was 12:30 p.m., March 3, 1974, at Orly Airport in Paris. Turkish Airlines Flight 981, a DC-10 jumbo jet, was getting ready to leave for London. On board were 346 people, travelers heading home, business flyers, and families returning after holidays. The weather was cool but clear, and takeoff went smoothly. Nobody had a clue the plane was carrying a hidden design flaw that would soon turn deadly. By 12:40 p.m., just minutes after takeoff, the crew climbed through 10,000 feet. Suddenly, a loud boom echoed through the cabin. In the cargo hold, the rear left cargo door had blown off. The pressure change was instant and violent. The floor above the cargo bay collapsed, ripping control cables and making some of the plane's systems useless. At 12:42 p.m., the cockpit crew realized something catastrophic had happened. Passengers were screaming as the cabin shook violently. The pilots struggled with the controls, but the DC-10 was now almost impossible to manage. The loss of the cargo door and the broken floor had severed crucial lines that controlled the plane's elevators and rudder. By 12:45 p.m., the jet was over the French countryside, shaking and dipping erratically. Air traffic controllers heard the crew's desperate mayday calls, but within minutes, the plane was plunging toward the ground. Witnesses on the ground later described seeing a massive aircraft wobbling in the sky, trailing pieces of debris. At 12:47 p.m., less than 20 minutes after leaving Paris, Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest, just northeast of the city. The impact was catastrophic. The plane was traveling at nearly 500 miles per hour when it hit. The crash left a massive scar in the forest, wreckage scattered across the trees. All 346 people on board were killed instantly, making it the deadliest crash in aviation at that time. By 1:30 p.m., French emergency crews were combing through the wreckage. The scene was overwhelming. Burned debris, torn metal, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. There were no survivors to help piece together the story. Investigators had to rely on the black boxes and the twisted remains of the aircraft. Over the following weeks, the truth came out. The DC-10 had a known design flaw in its cargo door. Just 2 years earlier, in 1972, another DC-10 had suffered a nearly identical incident in Detroit, but that crew had managed to land safely. Warnings were issued, but the fixes weren't enforced worldwide. On Flight 981, the door latch failed again, this time with no chance of recovery. The tragedy changed aviation forever. Cargo doors on wide-body jets were redesigned, and airlines were forced to follow stricter maintenance rules. But for the families of those 346 people, it was a devastating reminder that safety warnings ignored can have the deadliest consequences. American Airlines Flight 191. It was 3 p.m., May 25, 1979, at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Memorial Day weekend was starting, and the terminals were packed with people heading out of town. American Airlines Flight 191, a DC-10 jet, was preparing for a short flight to Los Angeles. On board were 271 people, passengers excited for the holiday, and crew members ready for what should have been a routine trip. By 3:02 p.m., the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied to the runway. Everything seemed normal. Families waved goodbye through the windows, and spotters at O'Hare's viewing area watched the big silver jet line up for takeoff. At 3:04 p.m., Flight 191 began its takeoff roll down runway 32R. Engines roared, the plane gathered speed, and within seconds the jet lifted off the ground. But just as it climbed past 300 feet, disaster struck. The left engine suddenly tore away from the wing. It wasn't just the engine. The entire pylon holding it in place ripped off, smashing into the wing and severing hydraulic and electrical lines. By 3:05 p.m., the pilots were fighting for control. Losing an engine by itself wasn't usually fatal, but the way it broke off caused a chain reaction. Instruments in the cockpit went dark, and the plane's left wing lost critical lift. On the ground, people saw the huge jet banking sharply to the left, its nose wobbling as if it were struggling to stay in the air. At 3:06 p.m., less than a minute after liftoff, the DC-10 couldn't hold anymore. The left wing dipped too far, and the plane rolled almost completely onto its side. Moments later, Flight 191 slammed into an open field just beyond the runway, exploding into a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. In an instant, all 271 people on board were killed, along with 2 people on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history. By 3:15 p.m., fire crews and ambulances were swarming the site, but there was nothing they could do. The wreckage was scattered across the field, engulfed in flames. Investigators and reporters arrived quickly, stunned that a modern jet could fall apart so violently only seconds after takeoff. Over the next months, the investigation uncovered a chilling detail. The engine hadn't fallen off because of a sudden defect in flight. Instead, it traced back to improper maintenance practices. Airlines have been removing and reattaching engines as a single unit with the pylon, faster but riskier than the official method. This shortcut weakened the bolts that held the engine to the wing. On Flight 191, those bolts finally gave way. The tragedy led to sweeping changes. The FAA grounded DC-10s worldwide until fixes were made, and airlines were forced to follow strict procedures for engine maintenance. Flight 191 became a case study in how cutting corners, even in small ways, can lead to catastrophic consequences. For many in Chicago, the sight of that fireball is still remembered today, a normal Friday afternoon that turned into the darkest chapter in American aviation history.